Today, most of us are aware that the world around us is ultimately made up of really small particles. We know that most of the things we see and touch are made up of atoms, which are themselves almost unimaginably small, and that they in turn are made up of even smaller particles, such as electrons and quarks. But how do we know this? How do we know that atoms aren't the smallest particles that exist? And how do we know what electrons and quarks are? And when it gets right down to it, what even is a subatomic particle? When we imagine them, we tend to think of small coloured spheres, like tiny bowling balls. But that's just because every textbook ever has drawn them like this. In order to understand the field of particle physics as it is today, we have to look at its history. Most of what we know about particle physics has been discovered in the last 200 years, but the basic idea that everything around us is made up of really, really small things goes back to ancient Greece. In the 5th century BCE, Democritus proposed that all matter was made up of small, indivisible particles. He called these particles atoms. Now, just because they're called atoms, don't think that the concept is the same as the modern-day atom. Atom is from the Greek atomon, which literally means uncuttable or indivisible. Democritus believed that there was only one kind of atom, and that it had no substructure. It was the simplest and smallest thing that could exist. Quite different from today's atoms, of which there are many kinds, and which do have substructure. Democritus believed that these atoms existed in otherwise empty space, called the void, and that the different materials and objects that we perceive in the world only seem different because these atoms are arranged differently. Then there was Plato. Plato was about 30 years younger than Democritus, and he did not believe that different materials were made up simply of different arrangements of the same kind of atom. He believed that everything was made up of a combination of the 4 classical elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and that each of these elements was made up of a different kind of atom. These 4 kinds of atoms were simply different three-dimensional shapes. Earth was made up of tiny cubes, air was made up of octahedrons, fire was made up of tetrahedrons, and water was made up of icosahedrons. The ancient Greeks really liked geometry, so it's perhaps not surprising that Plato thought that the smallest things in the universe were actually tiny, regular shapes. The ideas of Democritus and Plato were not without their critics at the time. Aristotle believed that atoms did not exist at all, and while Epicurus was convinced of the existence of atoms, he didn't think they could explain certain natural phenomena, such as earthquakes and lightning. Ultimately, though, there could be no consensus on what the world was made up of, because no one could do any experiments to find out. It turns out that to investigate the smallest things in the universe, you need at least electricity, if not a massive underground proton smasher. The ideas of the ancient Greeks are therefore called a natural philosophy, rather than a scientific theory. They tended to be based purely on abstract thinking rather than observation and mathematical modelling. Despite this, though, their ideas would go on to influence other European philosophers and scientists. And although the ancient Greek version of the atom wasn't exactly correct, the idea that all matter is made up of a set of indivisible particles is still broadly true.